On April 10, 1943, the quiet routine at Naval Air Station Quonset Point in Rhode Island was interrupted by the rapid chatter of a teletype machine. A high-priority dispatch from Pacific Fleet headquarters spelled out an escalating crisis. Japanese night activity had intensified to the point where American ground units, particularly on Guadalcanal, were reaching dangerous levels of fatigue. Reports indicated that entire formations of Marines were struggling to remain combat effective. The fleet's directive was blunt and urgent: create a functional night fighter force immediately. Lieutenant Commander William J. Widehelm studied the orders that established Night Fighting Squadron 75, VFN 75, the U.S. Navy's pioneering attempt to field a dedicated nocturnal air combat unit. The new squadron was authorized 18 pilots, 6 ground officers, and 30 enlisted specialists. Yet the roster revealed how unprecedented the task was. Only 5 pilots had meaningful instrument flight training. A mere 3 had flown the high-performance F-4U Corsair. The majority had experience limited to basic SNJ trainers, aircraft wholly unsuited for the demanding environment of night interception. What had begun as an emergency reaction to psychological harassment would, within a year and a half, transform the entire philosophy of U.S. carrier aviation. The Pacific conflict exposed a weakness few American planners had anticipated. Beginning in August 1942, Japanese aviators employed a deceptively simple method of nighttime disruption. Lone aircraft, often outdated float planes relegated to second-line duties, would approach American positions after sunset. Their pilots intentionally varied engine RPM to create an unsettling off-rhythm drone. This sound became infamous among exhausted Marines on Guadalcanal, who dubbed the intruders "Washing Machine Charlie." Sometimes bombs or illumination flares were released. Other times, the aircraft merely orbited for hours. The intent was not to destroy infrastructure, but to degrade human endurance, keeping thousands of men awake and slowly eroding their capacity to fight. This tactic emerged from a strategic acknowledgement within the Imperial Japanese Navy. They could not win an industrial arms race with the United States, nor could they reliably dominate conventional daylight engagements. Instead, they exploited a domain where the Americans were nearly defenseless. Japanese naval aviators were screened from the start of training for exceptional night vision capability, and those who passed were assigned to night harassment units operating aircraft that would have been hopelessly vulnerable under the sun, but were menacing in darkness. American countermeasures were limited. The U.S. Army Air Forces had sent a handful of P-70 night fighters to Guadalcanal in early 1943, but the aircraft's ceiling was too low, its radar outdated, and its success marginal at best. True nighttime defense required a technological leap, and that innovation was taking shape far from the Pacific front lines. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Radiation Laboratory, naval officers and civilian scientists were collaborating on a project launched in April 1942 under Commander Weg Taylor. Project Affirm, an effort to adapt British radar breakthroughs for American carrier aviation. Their work ultimately yielded the AN/APS-4 and its successor, the AN/APS-6, compact radar sets that condensed the capability of large shipborne systems into pods suitable for single-seat fighters. The AN/APS-6 represented a dramatic technological advance. Operating at approximately a 3.22-centimeter wavelength, it allowed a pilot to detect an enemy fighter at distances of 4 miles and maintain radar tracking to within roughly 50 yards, a remarkable level of precision for the era. The system employed 2 operational modes: a search display presenting range and bearing on a small circular screen, and a gunnery mode that generated steering cues for weapons engagement, enabling the pilot to maneuver without visual contact. Yet hardware alone could not solve the problem. Effective combat in total darkness demanded an overhaul of long-established air combat doctrine. Daylight tactics relied on visual cues, formation maneuvers, and sun positioning. Night fighting required procedural discipline, instrument proficiency, and individualized intercept techniques. To carry these new radar systems and withstand the strain of radar-guided combat, the Navy initially selected the Vought F-4U Corsair for modification, an aircraft known for its speed, range, and ruggedness, but also for its demanding handling characteristics. The formation of VFN-75 marked the beginning of a radical shift in U.S. naval aviation capability. Within 18 months, American night fighter units, equipped with advanced radar and trained under entirely new tactical principles, achieved overwhelming superiority. Japanese pilots soon recognized the imbalance. For many, the prospect of encountering unseen American fighters in the dark became so grim that they preferred to risk daylight battles instead. By 1944, the night sky, once a refuge for Japanese harassment operations, had become the domain of American interceptors who hunted with near-absolute freedom. The first generation of Corsair night-fighting aircraft, 34 machines designated F-4U-2, originated not from factory production lines, but from on-site conversions carried out at the Naval Aircraft Factory in Philadelphia and at Naval Air Station San Diego. Technicians refitted these airframes with a compact radar pod mounted on the starboard wing and rebuilt the cockpit environment to support nocturnal operations. Red illumination replaced standard lighting to protect a pilot's dark-adapted vision, while new blind-flying instruments and a centrally positioned radar display allowed aviators to manage both navigation and interception without having to divert attention from aircraft control. Although the modified Corsair served effectively in this role, it was soon surpassed by purpose-built night-fighting versions of the Grumman Hellcat, F6F3N, and later F6F5N, which ultimately became the backbone of carrier-borne night defense. Training pilots to fight in absolute darkness demanded a level of discipline and sensory adaptation well beyond ordinary flight instruction. At the newly formed Night Fighter Training Center at Naval Auxiliary Air Facility Charlestown, Rhode Island, the staff recreated the atmosphere of nighttime carrier operations with striking realism. Runways were outlined with faint glimmers of light to imitate the narrow deck of a warship, and arresting wires were stretched across the pavement to simulate shipboard recovery. From dusk until dawn, the facility remained in strict blackout. Students practiced reading their instruments instead of trusting instinct, deciphering radar echoes while executing complex intercept vectors, and landing on carrier decks where guidance cues were little more than barely perceptible signals. More than 60% of the trainees failed to complete the course, a measure of how unforgiving the discipline had become. Those who succeeded emerged as aviators capable of performing tasks that even experienced daylight pilots regarded as nearly impossible. Lieutenant John Phillips, an engineer who had left Bell Laboratories to join naval aviation, often summarized the stark reality for newcomers. Traditional dogfighting skills were nearly irrelevant at night. Survival depended on detecting the opponent first and eliminating any hesitation. Those who succeeded emerged as aviators capable of performing tasks that even experienced daylight pilots regarded as nearly impossible. Lieutenant John Phillips, an engineer who had left Bell Laboratories to join naval aviation, often summarized the stark reality for newcomers. Traditional dogfighting skills were nearly irrelevant at night. Survival depended on detecting the opponent first and eliminating any hesitation. The concept was proven dramatically on 31 October 1943. On a mission launched from Munda in New Georgia, Lieutenant Hugh D. O'Neill Jr. tracked and destroyed a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber roughly 12 miles southeast of the Shortland Islands. This marked the first aerial victory for VFN-75 and provided indisputable confirmation that radar-equipped fighters could locate and attack enemy aircraft in total darkness. The consequences were immediate. Japanese crews, long accustomed to operating after sundown with minimal opposition, now faced an unseen adversary. American forces, repeatedly subjected to nightly harassment, finally possessed an effective counter. The success accelerated the Navy's investment in night operations. Squadron VFN-76 formed on 1 February 1944, followed soon after by VFN-77, VFN-78, and additional units until the total reached 14. Each contributed detailed after-action analysis, gradually shaping a coherent and increasingly sophisticated body of night-fighting doctrine. One of the clearest demonstrations of this progress came from Lieutenant Commander Richard E. Hammer, the commanding officer of VFN-101. On the night of 29 January 1944, flying an F-4U-2 from USS Enterprise during the Marshall Islands campaign, Hammer conducted the Navy's first carrier-launched night fighter combat mission. Near Taroa, he intercepted another Betty bomber using methods that would have been impossible without radar guidance. Rather than closing from behind in typical pursuit, he climbed above the target to control the geometry of the engagement. When he finally dived, the Japanese crew never detected his presence. His single pass destroyed the bomber instantly, an outcome driven by the combination of advanced equipment and novel tactics for which no Japanese countermeasure yet existed. Mastering night landings at sea posed challenges at least as severe as aerial interception. Bringing an aircraft onto a moving carrier deck at daylight already demanded intense precision. Doing so at night with only dim deck lights and the hand signals of the landing signal officer to guide the approach pushed the limits of what pilots could physically and mentally endure. Early accident rates exceeded 30%. Barriers sometimes failed to stop aircraft that missed arresting wires, and wrecks occasionally ignited catastrophic deck fires. Yet procedures improved with remarkable speed. Aviators developed standardized callouts of altitude and range to maintain spacing without visual reference. Minimum fuel requirements were imposed to reduce the risk of uncontrolled approaches. Any pilot with fewer than 200 pounds of fuel remaining was ordered to ditch near a waiting destroyer rather than attempt a hazardous landing. Through these innovations, mechanical, procedural, and tactical, the U.S. Navy transformed night combat from an improvised necessity into a disciplined and efforts by the Imperial Japanese Navy to counter the growing effectiveness of U.S. night fighter operations exposed how far Japan had fallen behind in military electronics. Intercepts handled by the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific reveal that senior naval aviators convened a series of urgent strategy meetings as American nocturnal interceptions increased. Within these discussions, some officers argued that Japan should suspend night flying altogether, believing continued attempts would only lead to further losses. Others pressed for the rapid creation of rudimentary radar warning receivers in hopes they might offer even the slightest caution before American fighters struck. Yet these proposals collided with the hard limitations of Japan's wartime industry. Electronic manufacturing capacity, already strained by shortages of materials and trained labor, could not approach American output. While a single U.S. company, Westinghouse, produced more than 2,000 operational radar units, Japanese manufacturers assembled fewer than 50 airborne sets across the entire conflict. Most of those were plagued by such instability and maintenance problems that they rarely survived extended operational use. American capabilities, meanwhile, expanded rapidly. A major turning point came with the deployment of the F-6F-3N Hellcat in early 1944. The airframe offered better deck handling and greater stability at night compared to earlier types such as the Corsair, making it ideal for the increasingly sophisticated night carrier missions undertaken by U.S. forces. Carrier squadrons refined new intercept procedures that fully exploited radar improvements. Fighters were stationed at calculated positions to form radar barriers, invisible lines through which enemy planes could not slip unnoticed. Paired aircraft operated in hunter-killer formations, one pilot scanning by radar, the other focusing solely on spotting and identification. Aboard the carriers themselves, fighter direction officers became adept at managing multiple, simultaneous vectors, stacking fighters at varied altitudes to seal off entire approach corridors. The movement toward dedicated night aviation gained its strongest advocate in Commander Turner F. Caldwell. Convinced that mixing daytime and nocturnal air groups on the same carrier reduced combat efficiency, he campaigned for a radical solution, a ship devoted exclusively to around-the-clock darkness operations. Caldwell's proposal, once considered too experimental, materialized on 15 August 1944, when Night Air Group 41 was embarked on USS Independence, thereby creating the world's first carrier designed solely for night warfare. Transformations aboard Independence were extensive. The vessel received a suite of upgraded radar installations that offered a level of situational awareness unavailable on standard fleet carriers. Deck lighting was overhauled to minimize visibility to the enemy while still allowing safe recovery of aircraft. Work cycles aboard ship were reversed. Pilots and deck crews performed primary operations at night, while maintenance and repairs were concentrated during daylight hours. Night Air Group 41 comprised two units: VFN 41, flying 14 F-6, F-5N Hellcats, and VTN 41, operating 12 TBM Avengers equipped with airborne radar. Training, daily routines, mess schedules, and even the internal traffic patterns of the ship were reshaped to support a fully nocturnal rhythm. The group's first offensive action took place on 12 September 1944 during operations over the Philippines. The mission plan called for aircraft to arrive over their objectives as dusk settled, remain on station through the early hours of darkness, and destroy any Japanese planes attempting to lift off for night operations. Lieutenant William E. Henry led the fighter element, relying on radar to preserve formation cohesion while navigating largely by dead reckoning. At 21:45, Henry's radar scope displayed multiple rising contacts over Clark Field. The Japanese pilots, accustomed to routine harassment raids rather than sophisticated night fighter patrols, climbed in predictable patterns, unaware that a new phase of nocturnal American air dominance had begun. Henry's coordinated night assault unfolded with remarkable speed. Within the span of 3 minutes, his section eliminated 6 enemy aircraft, throwing the remaining Japanese pilots into disarray. In the pitch-black sky, some aviators lost spatial awareness and collided with one another, while others attempted hasty landings on darkened fields and crashed before they could reach safety. By the time the mission concluded, Night Group 41 reported a total of 14 victories in the air and another 20 enemy machines destroyed on the ground, achieved without a single American loss. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 further revealed how profoundly night fighters could shape large-scale operations. As the Japanese Navy prepared for what it hoped would be a conclusive showdown, American night-flying units maintained uninterrupted patrols that effectively blocked Japanese reconnaissance efforts. One of these crucial intercepts occurred on October 24, when Lieutenant Edward Chastain of Squadron VFN 41 brought down 3 scouting aircraft attempting to locate Task Force 38. Deprived of accurate intelligence, Japanese surface groups advanced blindly, engaging at the wrong times and in the wrong places, an error that contributed heavily to their disastrous defeat. By this stage of the war, night fighters were no longer merely a protective measure. They had become essential tools for offensive strategy. Technological progress accelerated this transformation. The late-war F-6, F-5N models, equipped with the ANPS-6A radar set, could detect targets approximately 6 miles away and follow several contacts simultaneously,
a capability unimaginable only a few years earlier. Identification friend or foe transponders reduced the risk of American pilots firing on their own aircraft, addressing a recurring problem from earlier operations. Improved VHF radios allowed pilots and controllers to coordinate even at great distances, tightening command and control during complex missions. Small innovations also carried weight. Red-tinted goggles, for instance, helped U.S. aviators preserve night vision while still being able to read cockpit instruments, whereas Japanese pilots often had to rely on improvised, far less effective solutions. Training systems highlighted the growing gap between the two sides. At Charleston, the Night Attack and Combat Training Unit regularly produced around 50 newly qualified night pilots every month. Its instructors were veterans with first-hand experience in the Pacific, and their lessons were supplemented by early synthetic trainers, rudimentary simulators that enabled hours of practice without consuming fuel. Japan, by contrast, was crippled by shortages and attrition. With dwindling supplies and few seasoned mentors left, replacement pilots commonly reached frontline units with under 100 flight hours, virtually no experience after sunset, and aircraft that lacked radar altogether. Within this environment, certain leaders emerged as pioneers in night fighting tactics. Lieutenant Commander James S. Gray, commanding VFN 78 aboard the USS Intrepid, was among the most influential. He introduced what became known as the loose juice arrangement, two fighters operating separately but close enough to reinforce one another when necessary. This simple adjustment expanded the patrol area while lowering the danger of mid-air collisions, an important improvement during radar-assisted operations. On August 31, 1944, Gray intercepted and damaged a Betty bomber roughly 90 miles east of Eniwaduk, an encounter that initiated a series of actions in which his squadron achieved numerous successes despite the limited performance of early radar equipment. The human aspect of night fighting produced its own extraordinary accounts. One of the most dramatic involved Lieutenant Robert Blackwell of VFN 91. On February 3, 1945, he became separated from the USS Yorktown while flying through a violent typhoon. His radar system failed, his fuel supply dropped dangerously low, and turbulence slammed his aircraft about so violently that he struck the canopy multiple times. Relying solely on dead reckoning, he persisted for hours until a faint radar return, barely detectable, finally indicated the presence of his carrier. He reached the deck with less than 5 gallons remaining in his tank. The aircraft was so battered by the ordeal that it was never flown again.
Japanese aviators continued to show remarkable resolve even as the strategic situation around them deteriorated beyond recovery. On March 15, 1945, Ensign Yukio, flying a worn and outdated Nakajima J-1N night fighter that lacked modern radar and suffered from inferior speed and climb, found himself facing 4 U.S. Navy F-6F Hellcats at once. Despite the overwhelming disparity, he pressed the attack. Reports indicate that he managed to inflict damage on one of the American fighters before being overwhelmed and shot down. His brief stand enabled a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft to slip through long enough to finish its assignment. Acts of this kind could not compensate for the technological gulf separating the two nations, but they illustrated a level of personal determination that persisted even as Japan's material situation collapsed. By late 1944, U.S. naval aviation was accelerating in the opposite direction, introducing increasingly sophisticated systems and refining night combat doctrine. When Night Air Group 90 replaced Air Group 41 aboard USS Enterprise in December of that year, it symbolized not just a change in personnel, but a significant step forward in capability. Under the leadership of Lieutenant Commander William R. Winston, VFN 90 operated the latest F-6F-5N Hellcats, each equipped with the improved AN-APS-6A airborne radar. Prior to deployment, the squadron had carried out more than 3,000 training interceptions at Barbers Point in Hawaii, giving its pilots a degree of night fighting proficiency
unseen in earlier phases of the Pacific War. Winston also implemented a tactical innovation that would prove decisive: a layered barrier patrol system. By stationing fighters in interlocking zones, he created a continuous web of radar coverage through which hostile aircraft struggled to pass undetected. This concept would demonstrate its full value within weeks. During operations supporting the landings at Lingayen Gulf on January 12, 1945, VFN-90 effectively showcased the total dominance the United States had achieved in nocturnal combat. Several Japanese formations attempted to reach the invasion fleet under the cover of darkness. Instead, they encountered American fighters positioned with mathematical precision, guided by shipborne controllers who combined their radar plots to direct every intercept with uncanny accuracy. In a single engagement, Lieutenant John Morris downed 3 enemy bombers almost consecutively, firing at exactly the range his guns had been harmonized for. Lieutenant William Levering, operating at altitudes so low that a radar altimeter was essential to avoid striking the sea surface, destroyed 2 incoming torpedo aircraft while tracking them against the confusion of ocean reflections. The results were catastrophic for the attackers. Over the course of that night, U.S. night fighters claimed 43 confirmed kills without losing a single aircraft. Later examination of Japanese records revealed the magnitude of the disaster. Out of 197 aircraft launched, only 34 returned in flyable condition. Survivors described the experience as terrifying. Lieutenant Commander Susumu Kimura later recalled that the American fighters seemed to appear from nowhere, unseen until their gunfire erupted, as if we were fighting invisible phantoms.
Behind these outcomes lay a vast industrial imbalance. From March 1944 through August 1945, American factories produced more than 26,000 ASB radar units and roughly 2,000 AN/APS-6 sets. Japan's industry, strained by shortages and bombing damage, succeeded in manufacturing only a few dozen rudimentary airborne radars, many of which malfunctioned after limited use. While U.S. carriers continually received upgraded radars, radios, and instrument packages, Japanese maintenance crews often resorted to dismantling wrecked aircraft to obtain spare parts, accelerating the decline of their operational readiness. The broader naval campaign demonstrated that night fighter capability was not merely a tactical asset, but a strategic one. Japan's inability to conduct reliable reconnaissance after dark meant that the U.S. Navy could maneuver its task forces with increasing freedom. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American night fighters prevented Japanese scout planes from locating Task Force 58 until the decisive air battles, later called the Marianas Turkey Shoot, were already underway. At Okinawa, constant nighttime patrols made Japanese airfields effectively unusable after sunset, forcing enemy operations into daylight hours where American air power reigned supreme. None of this would have been possible without the ground crews who supported the night fighter program. Working in nearly total darkness or under dim red lamps to avoid compromising shipboard light discipline, they performed intricate maintenance tasks by touch and memory. Their behind-the-scenes efforts ensured that radar sets functioned, instruments stayed calibrated, and engines remained reliable, an indispensable contribution to the U.S. Navy's nighttime ascendancy in the final year of the Pacific War. Radar specialists, an occupational category created expressly for the Navy's emerging night fighter forces, were required to maintain secret equipment even though they were rarely given full technical diagrams. Working largely from partial instructions and their own accumulated experience, these technicians managed to keep systems operational at rates that consistently surpassed those of daytime squadrons, despite the greater complexity of their gear. Among the many who embodied this commitment was Chief Aviation Electrician's Mate Harold Patterson of VFN-41. During one period of intense operations, he labored for a day and a half without pause to restore an aircraft damaged in combat, snatching brief moments of rest beside the wings between successive launches.
Weather, which Japanese planners typically regarded as an impediment, unexpectedly became one of the most valuable assets available to American forces. Japan's air doctrine relied on visual flight during clear conditions, leaving their pilots at a severe disadvantage when clouds or precipitation obscured the sky. U.S. night fighter crews, equipped with radar that functioned reliably in storms, fog, and low-visibility environments, could continue flying when their opponents were forced to ground their aircraft. Several major Japanese operations collapsed not due to American fire, but because they simply could not navigate through meteorological conditions that U.S. pilots routinely penetrated. This all-weather capability dramatically increased the achievable tempo of Allied activity, allowing strikes, patrols, and intercepts to continue without regard for atmospheric limits.
Communication technology played an equally decisive role. TBS, ship-to-ship radio circuits, enabled fighter director officers to coordinate multiple interception attempts at once. Early forms of data transmission linked radar sets across the fleet, letting ships merge their sensor readings into shared operational pictures. Standardized voice procedures, taught throughout the Navy, helped eliminate misunderstandings at critical moments and allowed controllers to maneuver aircraft with remarkable efficiency. By 1945, the electromagnetic spectrum had effectively become a new theater of conflict, one in which American electronic proficiency granted a decisive advantage before opposing aircraft ever made visual contact. Individual units also contributed innovations born from their unique circumstances. VFN 91, flying from USS Hornet, developed a new style of intruder mission. A single night fighter would slip into enemy airspace to attack Japanese aircraft during their takeoff and landing cycles. These sorties demanded extraordinary navigational precision, for pilots had to traverse vast stretches of open ocean in darkness and arrive above enemy airfields at exact moments. On 14 April 1945, Lieutenant Robert Holden demonstrated the method's effectiveness by shooting down 3 aircraft over Kinoya Airfield and returning through heavy anti-aircraft fire. Japanese reactions, preserved in interrogations and documents examined after the war, revealed the depth of their alarm. Admiral Soemu Toyoda acknowledged that Allied night fighters had eliminated our ability to conduct operations after sunset. We could not strike their forces, nor could we protect our own. Darkness, once regarded as a protective veil, had instead become a lethal trap. Junior officers reported that even seasoned pilots would feign illness to avoid night sorties, fully aware that facing radar-equipped Hellcats amounted to a near-certain loss. Night capability extended beyond fighters alone. VTN-90, the torpedo squadron assigned to Night Air Group 90, operated TBM-3E Avengers fitted with radar and used them for nocturnal torpedo runs, mine-laying missions, and even air-to-air engagements. Lieutenant Charles Henderson emerged as one of the most effective of these crews, claiming 4 aircraft, including a Kawanishi H-8K flying boot, thereby proving that night combat success was not limited solely to the dedicated fighter community. Technological development showed no sign of slowing as the war approached its final months. Engineers were preparing the F-6F-6M, featuring both a more powerful engine and the advanced APS-12 radar, which could detect targets roughly 10 miles away. The F-4U-5N Corsair, with capabilities exceeding those of any Japanese aircraft, was entering production, and jet-powered night fighters had progressed into design phases. Though the atomic bombings ended the conflict before these systems reached the fleet, the groundwork they laid shaped the trajectory of post-war night combat aviation. Numerous improvements emerged from tragedy. After 2 Hellcats collided above USS Randolph on 18 January 1945, the Navy implemented mandatory altitude separation for night formations. The catastrophic loss of Lieutenant Commander Robert Campbell's division on 3 December 1944 led to stricter weather minimums for nighttime training and operational flights. Each incident contributed to a growing reservoir of institutional knowledge that both expanded night flying capability and helped prevent similar accidents from recurring.
Economic assessments conducted after the war produced unexpected results. Despite higher training demands and the sophisticated equipment required, night fighter units achieved kill ratios even greater than those of daytime squadrons, approximately 18-1 compared with 11-1 by 1945. The psychological effect on the enemy produced benefits that exceeded pure attrition. The investment in night fighting programs, once dismissed by skeptics as extravagant or unnecessary, ultimately paid dividends far beyond initial projections. The cultural transformation within naval aviation was equally significant. Night fighter personnel, initially regarded as outliers by many traditional squadrons, earned deep respect as their successes accumulated. Skills once limited to specialized groups, instrument flying under stress, rapid radar interpretation, and disciplined radio communication became essential competencies for all naval aviators in the post-war era. Modern aerial warfare, as demonstrated by the Night Fighter campaign, revealed that mastery of technology had become just as vital as traditional piloting instincts, if not more so. The era in which intuition alone could carry a pilot through combat was fading. A new generation of aviators emerged, operators who had to interpret, manage, and fight through sophisticated electronic systems. Behind the scenes, night operations demanded enormous logistical machinery. Radar installations could not be serviced by ordinary aircraft mechanics. They required crews trained specifically in electronics. Replacement components crossed the Pacific under constant protection from humidity and salt, and even seemingly trivial items, red-filtered bulbs, delicate tubes for radar sets, precision display units, moved through their own dedicated supply routes. The achievements of night fighter squadrons were therefore as much a victory of organization and supply as of tactical evolution. A major benchmark came on 13 May 1945 when Lieutenant J. Smith of VFN 41 became the unit's fifth ace, raising his tally to 7 confirmed night kills. Having 5 aces within a 14-pilot squadron underscored how concentrated expertise had become when advanced equipment and focused preparation were brought together. In stark contrast, Japanese night fighter detachments, hampered by the absence of airborne radar and insufficient training, rarely managed to bring down even a single American bomber. The impact of these developments spread beyond the Navy. Marine Night Fighter Squadron VMFN 513, trained initially by naval specialists and outfitted with naval radar systems, produced noteworthy results from land bases. Army Air Forces units soon adopted Navy night fighting procedures and borrowed their technology, an unusual reversal of the typical inter-service competition. A distinct community of nocturnal aviators emerged, bound less by branch identity and more by a shared set of skills and challenges. Environmental conditions across the Pacific theater added another layer of complexity. Violent tropical storms could destroy aircraft just as efficiently as enemy gunfire. Bioluminescent plankton, glowing in the wake of moving ships, risked revealing the fleet's location to hostile reconnaissance. Extreme distances forced pilots to treat fuel management as a central element of mission planning, often more decisive than the engagement itself. These demands gradually produced a body of doctrine that blended electronic tactics, meteorological awareness, and long-range navigation into a unified operational philosophy. By the last months of the war, American dominance in the night sky had become so absolute that Japanese naval aviation effectively ceased dark hour operations. In July 1945, VFN 103, operating from USS Bonhomme Richard, flew nightly patrols without making contact. No enemy aircraft were willing to risk launching after sunset. The transformation was extraordinary. In less than 2 years, U.S. forces had moved from being vulnerable targets of washing machine Charlie nuisance raids to commanding the night with near total superiority, a shift on the scale of radar's initial introduction into warfare. On 29 July 1945, Lieutenant Robert Holden of VFN 91 carried out what would become the Pacific War's last nocturnal air-to-air engagement. He intercepted a Yokosuka P-1Y reconnaissance bomber attempting to photograph the invasion forces. Despite the intruder's aggressive evasive tactics, maneuvers that might have defeated any daylight pursuit, Holden's radar held the target throughout the chase. His gunfire eventually struck home, sending the Frances into the ocean and extinguishing the final operational spark of Japanese night aviation. The statistical outcome was remarkable. Between April 1943 and August 1945, U.S. carrier-based night fighters recorded 579 confirmed victories at the cost of only 32 aircraft lost in operations, an overall ratio of roughly 18-to-1. Japanese night attacks, which had caused serious anxiety among Allied forces in 1942 and early 1943, were so thoroughly countered that personnel arriving after mid-1944 often never witnessed a single hostile sortie in darkness. The psychological leverage Japan once held had been decisively reversed. According to the post-war United States Strategic Bombing Survey, the night fighter program played an outsized role in the erosion of Japanese air strength. By eliminating the protective cover of darkness, American forces forced Japanese units to operate primarily in daylight, where overwhelming American numbers and superior machines dictated the outcome. The psychological dimension of the campaign proved just as consequential as the tactical results. Once Japanese aviators realized that neither cloud cover nor darkness could shield them from interception, morale deteriorated rapidly. Reports from the period described a marked rise in flying errors, unauthorized departures from base, and outright refusals to undertake operational sorties. At the same time, the few crews tasked with night interception on the American side operated under extreme strain and deserved particular credit. They flew alone into unlit, often storm-torn skies well beyond the reach of immediate assistance. Daylight pilots could at least see danger materializing. Night fighter crews worked in a realm of limited visibility where each radar contact could equally be a hostile aircraft, a friendly patrol, or even a faulty return. Landings in such conditions carried their own hazards, contributing to an accident rate that consistently remained about 3 times higher than daytime flying across the entire conflict. Nevertheless, volunteers continued to step forward. A notable example of this persistence was Commander Caldwell's Night Air Group 41. During 7 months of continuous operations from the carrier Independence, the unit accumulated 1,743 sorties and 4,892 hours of combat flying. They were credited with 46 enemy aircraft destroyed. 5 of their pilots achieved ace status, among them Lieutenant William Henry, who secured 7 confirmed victories despite twice being shot down and forced to drift a combined 18 hours in life rafts before rescue. Even with a loss rate of roughly 27%, considered tolerable under night fighting conditions, the squadron earned a reputation for determination under extreme risk. The technological aftereffects of this effort extended far beyond wartime use. Compact airborne radar designed for carrier night fighters later became fundamental to civilian flight safety, enabling commercial aviation to operate reliably in poor visibility. The precise navigation and vectoring techniques refined during nocturnal interceptions directly contributed to the eventual architecture of modern air traffic control systems. Even the adoption of red, low-intensity lighting to protect night vision migrated into fields ranging from astronomical observation to medical practice. In this sense, the night fighter campaign accelerated innovations that would eventually benefit society at large.
Strategically, the doctrine lessons were equally far-reaching. The experience demonstrated that rapid technological adaptation could overturn long-standing operational advantages. The Imperial Japanese Navy had invested heavily for years in specialized training and tactics for fighting after dark, and yet U.S. forces, beginning with minimal night combat capability in early 1943, managed to achieve near-complete supremacy by late 1944. The implication was unmistakable. In modern conflict, mastery of emerging technology could outweigh even decades of accumulated expertise.
Leadership at the squadron level proved decisive as well. Lieutenant Commander Russell Reiser, later the commanding officer of VFN 76, implemented a training program that required every pilot to complete 50 practice interceptions before flying a real combat mission. His uncompromising approach produced extraordinary results. The squadron claimed 23 aerial victories during its deployment without losing a single aircraft to enemy action, a feat virtually unmatched in the annals of aerial warfare. This emphasis on exhaustive preparation eventually became a standard expectation in all U.S. night fighter units. The industrial base that supported these developments also extended beyond the radar factories themselves. It drew on a broad network of manufacturers, engineers, and logistical planners who enabled the night fighter initiative to grow from a small experimental effort into a decisive strategic capability. American industry gradually reshaped its production networks to support dedicated night fighting aircraft without interrupting the large-scale manufacture of daytime fighters. Entire assembly lines were adjusted so that nocturnal variants could be introduced alongside standard models with minimal disruption. Training infrastructure evolved in parallel. Specialized instructional aircraft, including radar-equipped SNJ trainers fitted with enclosed or hooded cockpits, allowed pilots to practice instrument procedures under conditions that simulated real combat. Even details that seemed trivial, such as paint compounds that glowed faintly on instrument panels, required industrial capacity and chemical resources that wartime Japan, strained by shortages and widespread damage to its factories, simply could not supply. Weather further magnified this disparity. In the Philippines, for example, the seasonal monsoon effectively immobilized Japanese aviation for long stretches. American fighters, guided by onboard radar, continued flying through the storms with relative reliability. This all-weather freedom meant that U.S. carrier groups could maintain operational pressure without regard for visibility or cloud cover, while Japanese air units were forced into inactivity by conditions that had traditionally provided natural lulls in combat. By the final year of the war, American night fighter doctrine had shifted dramatically. What began as a defensive response to nocturnal enemy raids matured into an aggressive strategy aimed at denying the Japanese the night altogether. Instead of merely intercepting incoming attacks, U.S. pilots increasingly sought out enemy aircraft near their own airfields. This new posture was illustrated most clearly during Operation Gratitude on 25 July 1945. In a single night, 32 American night fighters destroyed 29 Japanese aircraft, 18 on the ground and 11 in the air, effectively wiping out nighttime aviation capabilities across an entire region. Precision timing, radar-guided navigation, and coordinated control networks made such strikes feasible. Without the equipment and its supporting infrastructure, these operations would have remained aspirational. Advances in communications proved equally decisive. By 1945, U.S. night fighter crews typically operated with 4 separate radio channels, one dedicated to carrier or ship control, one for coordinating within their flight or division, one reserved for emergencies, and another for approach and landing. This system built in redundancy, allowing missions to continue even if a set malfunctioned or if the enemy attempted to interfere electronically. Japanese forces, usually restricted to a single shared frequency across multiple units, frequently encountered confusion and overlapping transmissions that degraded coordination during night sorties. Maintenance capabilities progressed at the same pace as tactical innovation. Near the war's end, specialized technicians aboard American carriers could completely overhaul airborne radar systems at sea, a level of proficiency unimaginable in 1943. Within these units, experienced machinists' mates, such as Chief Aviation Machinist's Mate Robert Chen of VFN 90, introduced field modifications that boosted radar reliability by roughly 40%. These improvements spread quickly through the fleet, a result of a command culture that encouraged bottom-up innovation. The immense distances of the Pacific imposed their own demands. Night fighters often flew near the limits of their operational range, making fuel management a critical skill. Pilots like Lieutenant Donald Patterson of VFN-41 refined economical power settings that extended endurance by about 20%, enabling deeper penetration into Japanese-held airspace and giving commanders new strategic flexibility. The methods exchanged through squadron circulars and instructional courses illustrated how persistently American night fighter units refined their craft. This continual process of adjustment and innovation became a defining trait of the U.S. night fighting enterprise. Its cultural impact on Japanese air crews proved severe. In interviews conducted after the war, numerous Japanese aviators admitted that the performance of American night fighters had convinced them the United States possessed almost otherworldly capabilities. Pilots who could perceive movement in total darkness, anticipate intentions, and materialize without warning. The psychological weight of this belief inflicted deeper damage than the loss of aircraft alone, contributing to a widespread collapse in morale. When Marine Captain Marion Carl toured Navy night fighter detachments in 1945, he noted a striking transformation. He remarked that the Navy had forged a new type of combatant, airmen who operated in an environment where conventional dogfighting instincts meant little. Their work resembled the silent pursuit of submarine crews more than traditional air combat, tracking shadows on instruments, engaging enemies they seldom saw with the naked eye. Carl considered the achievement both remarkable and faintly disquieting.
Economically, the investment paid dividends. Studies conducted after the campaign estimated that each night fighter aircraft prevented roughly 50 tons of enemy ordnance from reaching American troops and installations. The resulting reduction in damage easily justified the cost of equipping and maintaining entire squadrons. Even the intangible benefit of uninterrupted rest, thousands of personnel spared the constant strain of nocturnal harassment, boosted combat efficiency in ways impossible to measure precisely, but widely regarded as decisive. By the final months of the war, U.S. forces held an unmistakable advantage. During VFN 91's last operational patrol on 14 August 1945, its aircraft crossed above the Japanese home islands without encountering a single challenger. Enemy pilots, aware of the overwhelming danger posed by the American phantoms of the night, kept their planes grounded. What had begun as a desperate effort to counter crude harassment raids by Washing Machine Charlie had evolved into complete superiority in nighttime air warfare. This transformation echoed through later conflicts. Night operations in Korea relied directly on procedures first tested over the Pacific. Vietnam-era night missions incorporated techniques that originated around Guadalcanal and the Solomons. Even today's stealth aircraft, designed to slip into defended airspace undetected, trace elements of their conceptual lineage to the radar-equipped Hellcats that first gave the United States command over the darkness. Reflecting on the campaign, Admiral John S. McCain, Jr. noted that the United States entered the conflict unable to counter even modest nighttime threats, yet ended it with such dominance that many Japanese pilots viewed capture as preferable to flying after sunset. Achieving such a reversal in less than 2 years under wartime pressures stands as one of the most remarkable adaptations in modern military history. Despite the emphasis on technology, the human element remains central. Each engagement demanded exceptional nerve. Night fighter pilots operated alone, far from assistance, relying solely on their instruments and training, often in direct defiance of normal survival instincts. Their experiences underline the discipline and courage behind the statistics.
Lieutenant William Crawford spent his 23rd birthday drifting for 14 hours in waters known for sharks after a nighttime encounter forced him down. Lieutenant Robert Murray managed to bring his battered Hellcat aboard a carrier with no functioning canopy and ruined instruments. James Patterson, arrested on the final wire with a tailhook nearly sliced through, stopping mere feet short of disaster. These accounts demonstrate how individual bravery matched technological progress step for step. At dawn on 15 August 1945, Lieutenant Commander Winston led what would be the final night fighter mission of the Second World War. His aircraft orbited above Task Force 38, its radar sweeping an empty sky. The Japanese pilots who once launched nightly attacks with impunity had vanished, undone not only by losses in combat, but by the shattering of their confidence. The sanctuary of night had become a hunting ground dominated by American forces. Less than 2.5 years earlier, U.S. troops had endured relentless nocturnal raids, exhausted and demoralized by an enemy they could neither detect nor repel effectively. Now, as sunlight returned on the war's final morning, American night fighters controlled the darkness so thoroughly that many Japanese airmen preferred death to facing them again. Numerical results: 579 victories against 32 losses, and the establishment of 14 squadrons from none in roughly 2 years captured only a fraction of the accomplishment. The deeper triumph lay in doctrine and psychology. By uniting scientific advancement with tactical need, the United States demonstrated that technical adaptation could overturn long-held military advantages. As Winston's radar scope displayed nothing but clear sky, it symbolized the end of an era. The Japanese flyers who had once dominated the night had been defeated both materially and mentally. The darkness, once a refuge for their operations, now belonged to American airmen, and the future of aerial combat would be shaped permanently by the revolution they began.